So, good evening. I'm going to talk about the third poem with the title Love in Herbert's collection, The Temple, this evening. This is actually my second attempt at recording this video because I just tried a moment ago and it lost everything. So the first moral of this explicitly moral poem is save your work, although I don't think that's something that Herbert himself perhaps would have recognised. Anyhow, down to the poem. Shall we have a read of it? Love bade me welcome. Yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack, from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, the ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says Love, who bore the blame, my dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says Love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. So what we're looking at here is a poem which is in the form of a dialogue, which explores the communion between a Christian and God. Now this takes place at the communion service. So what we're looking at here is a poem which is in the form of a dialogue. The scene we're being asked to imagine is that the Christian has arrived to join a banquet which God is providing. God is the host. The Christian is the guest, God is the host. Now, this scene has a number of overtones which are worth just explaining before we really get into the close analysis of the poem, because it's worth that we need them really to be able to make sense of what's happening in the poem. The banquet could have two meanings. Number one could be Holy Communion, the service where Christians reenact the Last Supper, where Jesus gave his body and his blood to his disciples, and in doing so are absolved of their sins. The communion actually means being together, joining together. So the service of Holy Communion is where they consume the bread and the wine, and are thereby united with God. And you can see the last penultimate line of the poem, taste my meat, this image of food, is a very powerful expression of the image of Holy Communion. The other image of banquet, of course, is the banquet of heaven, the heavenly banquet. So we have two possible readings of this poem. Number one is that it's a poem about Holy Communion. The other poem is about death. However, what one critic has said is that actually there's no point really in trying to split these up. That actually is a poem about love. It's about how God's love works on two levels. Both the moment of Holy Communion, where living Christians on earth are allowed to be reunited with God through accepting Christ's sacrifice of his body and his blood in the form of that bread and wine, but also that heavenly banquet where God's love allows us finally to be reunited with him. Now this is where the unspoken wordplay of the poem becomes quite important. At Holy Communion, the bread and wine, that does honestly say bread, there is an A in there, I promise you, are called the host. We also know that the person who provides the banquet is called the host. And therefore in this poem, as I said, though it's never actually openly stated, there is a powerful wordplay at work. God is host on two levels. God provides the banquet. He is the host, as in the owner of the house, the person who is laying on all this food and drink. But he is also the host because he is the food and drink that is being consumed. So God is host on two levels. He is the host provider of the banquet, and he is the banquet. And that that pun actually would be lost to a lot of us who perhaps aren't familiar with the language of the host, but to Herbert's readers it would have been immediately apparent, because that word, the host, was something which was used very commonly to describe bread and wine at communion. So we'll have a little look through the poem now and try and make sure we understand what's going on in it. The first stanza is all action, really. It happens at the moment the door to the house is opened. Love bids the Christian welcome, and it's worth noticing. Go back to Drury's fascinating analysis of the poem in the first chapter of his book Music at Midnight. C.F. Drury here, the chapter on Herbert's World, where he talks about the prosody, that is the pattern of heavy and light syllables, of strong and weak syllables. The word prosody is what we use to describe the analysis of that. To look at the prosody of the first line, love bade me welcome, he says, they're all very light syllables, whereas yet my soul drew back. We have three very... So he talks about these light syllables of bade me welcome. There's only one stress in there, isn't it? We have welcome here, and he contrasts that with the three heavy syllables of soul drew back, the way that those heavy syllables enact the Christian spirit or the Christian soul's reluctance and nervousness. Really important in this poem to look at how Herbert uses prosody, uses these contrasts between heavy and light syllables, and look at where he lines up, or rather to combines different poetic feet within a line to emphasize, to create effects of stumbling or anxiety. I won't go through that here, but I strongly recommend that you actually do scan the prosody of this poem and give it a really good close analysis for yourself. So the soul draws back, guilty of dust and sin. Dust is one of the most important words in Herbert. Not only does it convey a feeling of dirt, but in fact dust itself is the whole condition of being human. We were, of course, formed out of dust by God in the Garden of Eden, according to the Bible. And so to be guilty of dust is actually to be in a state of sin simply because you are human. And dust is one of those words that reoccurs throughout Herbert's poetry. Every time you see it, be really, really attentive to it. The image of quick-eyed love in line 3 is important because Cupid is conventionally depicted as being blind, hence love is blind. Cupid himself doesn't know who he will strike next as he shoots his arrows, hence the idea of love, or erotic rather. Erotic love is something which is unpredictable. I think Herbert's description of this love as being quick-eyed is a way of distinguishing the love in this poem from conventional erotic love, something we've seen in Jordan, in Love 1, as where he's really interested to differentiate the love he experiences for God from conventional love. However, this poem is full of language of sensuality. He grows slack. It's very hard for us to overlook. First of all, there's the simple reading, isn't it? He grows slack. He draws back. He shrinks back from a feeling of unworthiness. But actually, there's an implication here of sexual impotency here, isn't? And especially as modern readers, I think we might find it rather difficult to reconcile the religious message of this poem with the rather, sensual language. I think for readers in Herbert's time, they would have been more accustomed to, not the Songs of Songs, but the Song of Songs. Now, the Song of Songs is a book in the Bible which is actually love poetry. It's about a bride and a bridegroom, and it's the poetry they speak to each other, and it is very, very powerfully erotic in a lot of its imagery and its ideas. And the Song of Songs was often used as an image of the love that the human has for Christ, and the love where Christ represents the bridegroom and the church on earth represents the bride. And I think in Herbert's time, the use of very sensual language to express feelings of Christian spiritual love would have been more acceptable, or not acceptable, that's the wrong word, but it would have been more familiar to his readers. Certainly, even up to the even in a century and a half later, when Bach was setting his cantatas, the language there in Protestant poetry in Germany was often explicitly erotic in describing the feelings that the soul has towards Christ. So what for a modern reader might be a rather jarring experience, the uncomfortable sort of growing slack, taste my meat, we find difficult. But for Herbert's period, perhaps that distinction wasn't so... it wasn't one that they found uncomfortable at all. Anyhow, love draws nearer, which is an interesting contrast, of course, to draw back. And the word sweet is another really important Herbert word. Sweet, Wilcox argues, and I'm going to write this up in the top right-hand corner here, Wilcox, who is a fine scholar of Herbert, who has published a wonderful academic edition of his poetry. Wilcox argues this is one of Herbert's favourite words. And it's to describe the intense experience of God. It's worth thinking that sweet actually can refer to so many different experiences. A taste can be sweet, a smell can be sweet. We can describe a sight as sweet, actually. A sound can be sweet. So that sweetness is kind of all-encompassing. It's interesting, though, the sweet is questioning, but it is sweetly questioning. The God in this poem is much more gentle and consoling and comforting than the God, for example, in John Donne's poem, Batter My Heart. And I recommend you look this up. That's Batter My Heart by John Donne. It's a much more aggressive poem where Donne imagines God as being a powerfully sort of masculine figure. So in the next stanza, we have the point where the dialogue actually begins, and the soul says, or the Christian says, "A guest I answered, worthy to be here." Now this is a very common image that perhaps speakers, or an image that draws on the Bible. There's a parable in Matthew chapter 12, verse 11, where the sinner, or a guest, arrives at a wedding incorrectly dressed and is cast away, is turned away by the host of the wedding feast. And this host, though, says, "You shall be he. You are the guest who's worthy to be here." The word unkind in line 9 is important because kind, of course, not only means generous or caring. So to be unkind is to be ungenerous or nasty or cruel, but to be unkind is unkind is to be unnatural. Kind in the sense of a type or a certain correctness of something. So unkind is yes, unnatural here. "Ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee." Now this image of looking on someone, of course, again is a sign of respect. A lot of critics have drawn attention to the fact that courtesy is very important in this poem. Now, for us, courtesy means simply good manners, perhaps rather old-fashioned good manners. In Herbert's day, courtesy was an elaborate and very strict set of rules governing how you behaved. In various social situations, depending on where you stood in your social rank compared to somebody else. And the language of courtesy in this poem, or in fact the whole poem is structured around the idea of courtesy, of the guest's ostentatious humility, of the host's generosity. And love takes my hand and smiling did reply. So we can see that this kind of enactment of courtesy, of the guest's reluctance to look on him, is a sign of a word of deference, of acknowledging your inferiority to somebody of a higher social status. Line 12 is a rather nice little pun. "Who made the eyes but I?" Not only, of course, the eyes with which the guest shall look on God, but eyes as in a pun on I. Who made the eye but I? In other words, I made you. We can now also have a look at the final stanza, because it's interesting that in the final stanza we get some really powerful biblical images dominating the text. The idea of the "let my shame go where it doth deserve" could be an echo of the second book of Samuel in the Old Testament, chapter 13, verse 13, which asks the question, "Whither shall I cause my shame to go?" Who bore the blame is an echo of Hebrews chapter 9, verse 28. The last line of the poem, "So I did sit and eat," actually arguably evokes Psalm 17, and also a quotation from the Song of Songs, which I'll abbreviate here as Songs, chapter 2, verse 3 to 4. I'll just read you that quotation. "I sat down with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love." Read you that once more from Song of Songs, chapter 2, verses 3 to 4. "I sat down with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love." So this image here that Herbert is offering us in the last line is, in many ways, an image of a bride and a bridegroom being united. So this "I sat down with his fruit was sweet to my taste" is the bride describing the bridegroom feeding her at the wedding banquet. "He brought me to the banqueting house, his banner over me was love." So we have then here in the final line of the poem not only the beautiful resolution of the whole problem of the poem of feeling inferior, but also again this sort of sensual language, the language of erotic love, which perhaps Herbert suggests can be used to describe the feeling of loving God. It's worth noting actually that this line here, "Truth, Lord, but I have marred them, let my shame go where it doth deserve," we should be careful before we sympathise too simply with the speaker. The reason being that actually John Donne, a name we've mentioned before, said himself that humility is itself, and he wrote this as two words, a pride. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, humility, of course, is that expression of feeling humble, of feeling inferior, and he said actually that can be a form of pride. I think the modern term humble brag can be quite useful in understanding this. That if you have that a very ostentatious demonstration of humility, "look at how inferior I am," and showing off how meaningless you are and how unworthy, actually can itself be a form of pride. It's a sort of in itself is sort of self-regarding and lacks actually true humility. So that's what's interesting in that line, arguably, that the speaker there is so wrapped up in his own humility that he almost is proud of it in some ways. Look how humble I can be. So anyhow, there's a little overview of the poem. Do remember Drury's, go back to him, do reread Drury's analysis of the poem. Is really clear in terms of analysing the prosody of it. It's worth noting one last point, actually, this finis, glory be to God in high and earth peace, goodwill towards men. And the critical question I would like to put to you is, and this finis tells us that it was because this was the last poem in the collection of poetry called The Temple, which was, of course, what Herbert gave to his friend to be published almost on his deathbed. And I would like you to think is, why did Herbert put this last? And the other critical question is, how do we respond to the sensual language of the poem? So two critical questions for you. Why did Herbert put this last in his collection of poems, The Temple? And secondly, how do we, as modern readers, respond to the sensual language of the poem? So there you are, Love number 3 by George Herbert.